So I want to talk about some of the risk factors, the potential bear cases, but I also want to give you the opportunity first to lay out what you think is the longer term bull case for Bitcoin.
Yeah, so the longer term, and let's say a decade, roughly speaking, bull case for Bitcoin is, first of all, yeah, it continues to take market share from gold. Okay, that's already, you're making a multiple of your money, right? Because if Bitcoin is in the hundreds of billions of value today, well, gold is, roughly 10 trillion. Oh, and by the way, I expect the price and the value of gold overall to go up with time, not down this decade. That's based on my expectations that inflation will probably run hotter this decade than it has in the last few decades. But as far as the further upside is concerned, Bitcoin is hard money, and embedded in that is the word money. And so you can transfer value with Bitcoin. So if it reaches its potential, Bitcoin could take market share from fiat currencies. It could take market share from other stores of value, including the bond market. You have to ask yourself, well, if we're living in a world where real interest rates, inflation adjusted interest rates, are still negative, do I really want to hold bonds? Or do I want to hold less bonds? Do I want to substitute some Bitcoin for gold? And do I want to substitute some gold for bonds? So those are areas of potential upside. Real estate, even as a store of value, right, has some store of value and monetary characteristics. For high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals, if the decision is, oh, should I own a third property, or should I own this asset that if I choose to cross a border with the information in my brain, right? If I can memorize 12 words, I can take it anywhere with me. Right. Do I want to own some of that asset? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I want to own some of that asset. And that gets us to a whole other category, which is offshore assets in general, right? Bitcoin is, in some sense, inherently an offshore asset. It lives in the internet in a distributed network rather than any particular jurisdiction. And certainly jurisdictions do apply their local rules to the extent they can with Bitcoin. But if the offshore asset market is anywhere between 10 and $30 trillion, nobody truly knows how big it is. But suffice to say that Bitcoin is likely to continue to take market share. I think it already has from that class of assets. So all the categories that I just mentioned are multi-trillion or multi-10 trillion dollar markets. If you talk about the bond market, you're even talking about 100 trillion. So it's really not difficult to get to total valuations for Bitcoin on the order of $1 million per Bitcoin and up, which is 30 or 35 times the current price today. And so getting to tens of trillions of dollars for Bitcoin is quite achievable over, let's say, a decade. And in the long run, it could even be in excess of $100 trillion if it truly reaches its potential and becomes a reserve asset and a monetary standard across the world.
So let's talk a little bit about the risk factors here with Bitcoin, uncertainties and criticisms. A couple of them I think you're obviously very well versed with. The first is the incredible volatility of Bitcoin relative, for example, to the price of gold in terms of the risk of it impairing store of value.
Yeah, so this is really arguably Bitcoin's weakest point, right? As an investment or as an asset that's trying to be hard money in the long run. And certainly it's a concern. I mean, Bitcoin is clearly the most volatile in terms of US dollar price, most volatile major asset in history, I think. I mean, I certainly can't think of an asset that's achieved hundreds of billions of dollars of value, yet have a vol level that Bitcoin does. So right. that is a consideration. And so as an investor, what do you think about? Well, you think about a couple things. You think about the total addressable market as I just laid it out, and you invert and you say, okay, if Bitcoin weren't more volatile than gold, what would its price be, or what would its value be? My answer to that is probably the price would be a lot higher, right? Order of magnitude or more. So Bitcoin reaching its potential does imply lower price volatility over time. And in fact, that is empirically what we observe the trend to be. So Bitcoin's been around for over 13 years now, but we've really only had reliable price data for roughly 11 years. Then what you see with Bitcoin prices, almost every single year, the average volatility reduces. And certainly over multi-year periods, the average volatility has reduced significantly. So the trend is good in terms of volatility. Nevertheless, we're at a point where the volatility is still higher than the vast majority of assets in investors' portfolios.
Right.
And I think that's just something you live with. I mean, I have clients ask me all the time about the volatility. That is, I think, their biggest concern, or certainly it's among their biggest concerns.
Right.
And if you have a long-term view, if you can hold Bitcoin for at least 4 years, history says that you're likely to do well. And of course, we always have to caveat that past performance is not necessarily an indication of the future.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the other risk factors. Another thing that comes up quite frequently is regulatory uncertainty, tax uncertainty. Tell us a little bit about how you think about those challenges.
I think regulatory uncertainty is probably one of the most misunderstood characteristics for Bitcoin. And this is where Bitcoin stands apart from the rest of digital assets and crypto assets, right? Because Bitcoin is fairly clearly not security. And by the way, I'm not a securities lawyer, but having studied it to the extent I have, there was never an exchange of value for money, right? So by the Howey test, it doesn't trigger the securities designation. And in fact, the CFTC has been calling it a commodity for a long time. The IRS has treated it as property for tax purposes. And so it's pretty clearly not a security under US law. Having said that, there are plenty of other digital assets that are securities, most likely under US law. And we will see how some of those cases shape up over time, or we may see more clarity from legislation at some point. But I see the risk of securities designation for Bitcoin itself as extremely low. And I think people sort of frequently lump it into the category of other digital assets that are at greater risk of being deemed as securities. And I think it's rather different in that regard. Yeah. Tax is another area you mentioned. There actually was a proposal put forth recently by Senators Lummis and I think it was Sinema, which, if adopted, and certainly it's early, who knows if it'll pass in its current form or at all, but it would treat transactions below $200 effectively as non-taxable. I think that for Bitcoin to reach its potential as transactional money that's frequently used to buy things, then fixing that, the capital gains treatment or the property treatment is an issue, because I don't want to go, I don't want to track my tax basis in the Bitcoin I go pay for a cup of coffee, right? That's obviously a huge barrier. Now, am I worried about that anytime soon? Not really. I mean, for me, there's so much investment upside potential just for taking market share from gold. Gold is also taxed as an investment asset. And so, yeah, I think for Bitcoin to reach its ultimate potential, where it's millions of dollars of value per Bitcoin, yes, then de minimis exemptions from transactional use of Bitcoin will be helpful, or maybe even required to reach that potential. But between where we are today and that possible eventual outcome, there's still a lot of potential upside for Bitcoin.
Yeah, you make an important point about legislation. Obviously, it's very early. The legislation that we've seen proposed by, I believe it's Senator Lummis and Senator Gillibrand, obviously is an important piece. We'll have to see exactly, as you said, whether or not it gets there ultimately. But it does seem very likely that we are going to get more legislation addressing Bitcoin and other digital assets as we go forward. Obviously, this is something that is on the minds of legislators and regulators alike.
Hey visionaries, thank you for tuning in. For more free crypto content like this, head over to realvision.com/crypto. You'll get early access to the most brilliant minds in the space to cut through the noise, get in-depth analysis, and get you ahead of the curve with unbiased insights.